who supposedly consented to, if the skin of your color is not white and you look threatening, we will kill you. We think that on this side of the house, the social contract and any idea of consent is much higher, and we're going to tell you exactly why it has, like lethal force has to be outlawed, not just education. But before I do, I'll get into a little bit of direct rebuttal with a pretty contradictory case you hear coming in open opposition, right? The first thing you hear coming out of the first speaker is that police will be scared, therefore they will be afraid to engage in minority communities that may be more violent. But then his partner says that they will want to engage more arbitrarily, much more frequently through things like stop and frisk. We think that's a contradiction that they should have worked out before they had their speeches. But secondarily, we tell you, even if we assume they'll be afraid to engage in these communities, we don't think that's the case, right? There's a reason why people sign up for the Marines rather than the Air Force, even though we're better. The reason is they enjoy going into places of danger. They feel like their duty is so important that when they put their life in danger, they feel that is the epitome of their duty. We don't think that means police officers will turn away. They also say that they won't be able to use deadly force when necessary. Again, I think we need to clarify, because the opening government team did not say that. They said they can't use it preemptively, right? So if someone is shooting at me, they're not going to say, get me closer so I can club them. No, they're going to be able to shoot, right? There is this idea of preemption. When you are being shot at, that is lethal force already being used, not preemptive. I think that's important to the distinction to be made. They also tell you that this makes it easier to ignore racism. We simply don't think that's true. We think that it's easy to ignore racism. When Eric Garner was killed, the question was the policeman justified or not? The question that consumed the news was not, why did he do it? Are police racist? We think that when you take away any possible justification for this use of lethal force, you clarify the debate, and no longer 201, should he or should he not use lethal force? Because the answer is a clear no, but rather to one focus on why he did it. But finally, they talk about this kind of angry backlash that will re-entrench it. Sure, segregation caused people to be angry, but probably led to a lot of good in the long run. Because at the end of the day, if you have education, if you outlaw things that are incredibly dangerous, you're going to eventually solve. We think that's incredibly important. Let's talk about why you necessarily need to outlaw it. We think legal structures play an important role in creating norms in both the police force and society at large. Number one, let's talk about on the police force level, because we do think that policemen, like most military members, get this sense of pride out of fulfilling their duty, out of being the embodiment of the law. And we think that on a very basic level, when you make this something that is outlawed, rather than something that is education, then they're inherently much, much less likely to do it. Not necessarily exclusively because of prosecution, but because they feel like they want to be like this embodiment of legality. We think that's incredibly important because we do solve for a lot of these harms. But society at large is also important because the police force is part of the society. We need to solve on both of these levels for three reasons. One, we think this idea of saying that you have to use non-lethal weapons as a law creates this mentality that people who threaten you are not just targets, but they're rather human that are currently threatening you. Why is this distinction important? Because currently, when police officers see someone, they think of them as a target, something that should be annihilated or destroyed. But when you make a law saying it is illegal to do that, you need to use non-lethal force, that changes the mentality. Where have we seen this? We have seen this in the armed forces. When we went to Iraq, we faced a lot of incredible insurgency. But when we had the surge, we said, soldiers, you can't fire unless being fired upon. What did that do? The Iraqis felt like they were being humanized, and the soldiers did too. Plenty of training had already happened to say that same thing, but when it became a law, people felt like they were humans and were willing to engage more. Secondarily, we think you inherently feel less threatened because you realize prosecution is an option, right? The people feel like if the police violate that, you can take it to court and probably win, which means that they're more likely to engage with the police, and the police realize that they could be suspended, which means they're less likely to do it. We think that when prosecution is a viable option, the police will no longer feel like they are above the law. Three, we think that a creation of a law just perpetuates a narrative, right? This idea of media exposure in which you will hear about previous experiences that were good, right? Which means that people will say, rather than a policeman needs to kill, they'll hear the stories where a policeman used non-lethal force, where the policemen were able to take down an assailant without this use of lethal force. We think that this narrative is incredibly important to create across society, and police officers receive education every single day. We think a law outlawing a certain tool is something much more important and much more powerful in creating a narrative opening.
like, they talk about this narrative, but I already dealt with this when I talked about how powerful and persuasive the victim narrative the police use in the media all the time is. It won't result in what you want. It'll just re-entrench anger against the both communities more.
I don't think that's true, right? Again, like, one, they did re-entrench anger probably against the African-American community when segregation ended, but in the long term, the solution was something that was important, which is you can't kill someone just because they look threatening and they're black. But secondarily, we tell you that that narrative will exist even if it isn't the majority narrative, and we think that's very important. So, what do we think also about the police officer responsibility? We think that the police officers, because they are better protected, they have an inherently greater responsibility to be judicious and have stricter scrutiny on the type of lethal force that they use. What are we talking about? One, we think police officers have things like body armor and bulletproof cars, which means that if they're going to be shot, they're probably not going to die because they're going to shoot you in the chest. We think this means that they can have some comfort in knowing that this probably won't be lethal. Two, we think that legal structures exist. If someone kills a police officer, they're going to get probably life in prison, if not the death penalty. Whereas if someone kills an unarmed black guy, they're probably going to be let off under the status quo. We think that when you change this, because police officers have this protection, they do have a higher responsibility to use force more judiciously. But third, we tell you they have incredibly quick things like hospitals and medical protection. When a police officer is shot, he gets medevaced in a helicopter, but Michael Brown sat on the street unknown if he was dead or alive for an hour. We tell you that all of these factors mean that police officers won't die. Their violence against them will be less lethal. We tell you that means they have a higher responsibility. But more importantly, we tell you they consented to it. They said, with these protections, I will put my life in danger. A regular civilian never said, if I am black and look threatening, I deserve to be shot. They never consented to that. We think that this distinction, this comparative between the police officer and the citizen is incredibly important because he doesn't have those protections. He never consented to the type of violence that the police officers enact on them on almost a daily basis. We tell you that the best way to solve this is to stop this legal violence. We are very proud of our pets.
I would like to welcome from the opposition side the member.
Don't judge me.
Well, that's my job.
Not you, her. Sorry, you can judge me.
Order.
You guys just don't chant anymore or something? What is this? You failed. You failed me.
No, they don't.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that there's a vast mischaracterization on what the police force actually looks like and what purpose they serve in society from the government side. And I don't blame them, right? Like, we know what the 24-hour news cycle looks like. We know that the vast majority of cases actually follow this non-violent narrative that the last speaker talked to you about. But the problem is that we have this world that says that the vast majority of them does not. And in fact, the vast majority of them are like the Eric Garner case. The vast majority of them are like the Michael Brown case. We know that that's not the case. And in fact, we know the vast majority of them are non-violent, are within the training that we talk about saying is within our jurisdiction on this side of the house. To that end, I want to talk about two things in this round. First and foremost, I want to talk to you about the balancing of the right to deadly force, because I think that something they fail to recognize in this round is that we exist in a world where citizens have the right to possess deadly force and use deadly force. And so I think if we talk about police officers, as they say, these arbitrators of the law, these embodiment of the law, they have an obligation to uphold your right to deadly force, which means that sometimes they're going to need the capacity to use deadly force as well. But secondarily, I want to talk about the idea of the entrenchment of the us versus them, because I think that the problem that happens in this world when they tell you, like, oh, we're going to get rid of racism, is that we stop actually having the important conversations about racism that come from the ability to say, this person is racist, they've done something really terrible, and now we just have like, oh, well, they get more tickets, well, they're sentenced more, but those aren't fun to talk about. I'm not going to put them in the news. We're just going to pretend racism doesn't exist anymore. So I'll talk about that. Before that, some rebuttal on what we get from the last speaker. Firstly, he tells us the idea of the police force is that they exist to embody the law, and they have a pride for their duty. And first and foremost, he's like, yeah, if we change the law, they're just going to follow it. Like, honestly, if these douchebags are as racist as we're talking about, like, they like killing, as we hear in the Mike Brown case and things, sorry, the Ferguson cases, I don't think they're actually going to give a damn about you changing the law. If they're racist, if they don't care about the standards that exist right now, I don't think that they're actually going to care. And I don't think he gives you an adequate enough link about that. If these people are as evil as they possibly say and don't follow the current standards, they're not likely to follow the standards they set up here just because they're the embodiment of the law. But to tell you is that honestly, we think that it's not as if they get off scotch-free in this type of situation, ladies and gentlemen. Like, the reality of the situation is that they have a much higher standard of burden of proof in these situations. If you even fired your gun as a police officer, there's an investigation, even if you don't hit anybody, right? We think the reality is that, yes, some of these situations are racist, and it's proven in, like, the Ferguson cases that there is racism there, but not allowing them to use their gun for deadly force in instances in which they might need to preemptively to prevent more violence is not going to actually fix that type of situation. We think these investigations are good. We think they should continue, but we don't think that police force is something that necessarily just needs to go away altogether. Secondly, they talked about the idea of this humanizes the situation, and they give you the example of Iraq. But we say, ladies and gentlemen, the standard now we think is pretty human, right? When the standard now says that you have to be in a life-threatening situation or have perceived your life to be threatened in order to use deadly force, we think this is a very fair standard and a very human standard. Beyond that, the idea that you have to only fire if you're fired upon first has put a significant amount of people like UN peacekeepers in a lot of danger because they're fired upon first and they're not expecting it and they don't have the ability to respond properly to these types of incredibly dangerous situations, especially when you realize that police officers aren't just a shield for themselves and a shield for their own body, but oftentimes a shield for innocent bystanders. Like, oh, let them get shot at first. Like, if they get shot and taken down, you have a problem for a lot more people too. But lastly, they talked about the idea of this non-lethal force narrative, and we're going to tell you, we think that narrative naturally exists in most situations, and in fact, that non-lethal force narrative was brought up in multiple examples on both sides of the house. We think the reality is that most of these situations are non-lethal, most of these situations are that important narrative. We don't think that you need to institute this law to make people believe that you cannot use lethal force. Lastly, they talked about the fact that police need to be protected and things of that sort. We're going to tell you at the end of the day, like, yes, police do need to be protected, and we think that the reality of the situation is that them having deadly force at their hands is going to give them the ability to actually do this. So I'm going to talk about positive matter. Let's talk about balancing the right to deadly force. Because I think something that's been largely ignored on this side of the house is that, like, the world that we live in, I think we're all presuming we're talking about the United States in this round. The world that we live in is a world that has accepted the public's right to use deadly force, to possess deadly force, to possess guns, and things of this sort, right? And we also recognize that it's really funny in this world that we're, like, living in, that everybody in this room, right, has the right to castle doctrine and stand your ground laws in California, but now somehow police officers don't even have the same rights to self-defense that basic citizens have if they're fired upon. First and foremost, I don't think this is going to get rid of the issue that we have of racism with people like George Zimmerman, right? But the reality is that average citizens have the capacity to use deadly force against each other, and most importantly, against the state. If we want to look at what the role of the police is, ladies and gentlemen, it is to enforce laws, it is to protect rights, and to enforce this, this social contract that gives people these rights. The reality of that situation then is if they are the arbiters of these rights, if they have the capacity to ensure that people continue to have these rights and possess these rights, it means in a lot of cases they're going to need to have the ability to defend people against the abuse of their right to use deadly force, which means sometimes they're going to need the capacity to use deadly force against one another, against other individuals. Because as we said, ladies and gentlemen, police officers aren't just a shield to themselves. Yes, they can preemptively attack to defend themselves, but defending themselves oftentimes means defending a significantly larger amount of bystanders as well. We think that that's really important. At the end of the day, we tell you that we're going to enforce the social contract more on our side of the house to protect people from dangerous rights that, yes, they have the right to, but that can be abused. And more than that, we think that we give police officers the ability to defend themselves significantly better than they would have in this world where they simply say, don't defend yourself, which oftentimes means don't defend other people as well. Go ahead.
Two narratives are just completely untrue for minorities on your side of the house. One, the fact that they make this whole non-lethal force narrative, say that's the hundreds of unarmed black men that have died at the hands of officers. But secondly, the fact that you say that blacks feel like they have the right to defend themselves against officers. They can't even question it without being beaten to a pulp, apparently.
Right, we're not going to tell you that what happened in Ferguson was correct, but the reality is that they determined that that was a racist decision and that things should have gone to trial. That is not a problem with the fact that the police officers used deadly force or had the capacity to use deadly force. Rather, that is a problem with the justice system that not take them to trial and hold them to the standard that we already currently think is incredibly fair, right? The second thing I want to talk about is the entrenchment of the us versus them mentality, because the reality of the situation is this rhetoric, and you hear it after the last speaker with this point about the nonviolent narrative isn't popular enough. The large majority of cases handle these things properly. The large majority of cases, ladies and gentlemen, deal with this situation of domestic violence, deal with these situations of racial tensions properly, without deadly force. But we exist in a world that has this 24-hour news cycle that says all of them are bad. And now they tell you, here, we need a law that says all of them are bad. All of them have the capacity to be racist. All of them have the capacity to kill people for no fucking reason. The reality of the situation is that most of them don't. But you get rid of the trust that exists you get rid of the ability to say that this is a situation that can be solved. And in fact, we think you give people simply a facade of solvency that we actually don't think fixes any of the racism whatsoever.
Thank you very much. To close out the government bench, I would like to welcome up the government whip.
So this debate ultimately comes down to one thing, and that is, like, does the impact of social justice outweigh the right of a cop to preemptively fire a weapon? So the two questions to answer that is, first of all, is the impact significant? Secondarily, to what extent does an officer have the right to defend themselves? I think this side of the House has done a good job of showing you why that doesn't extend to this preemptive fire, and why the impact is enough to solve things like the racist stereotypes we get, and also the violent aspects that people use. Let's get to some rebuttal before I answer these questions, right? So ultimately we get like an interesting case out of the last speaker. She says citizens have deadly force, and thus police officers need to protect themselves against that. But when we think police officers like do have, they still have access to deadly force, they just can't use it preemptively, right? Like I can't just shoot you because you might attack me in 5 minutes of your life, right? Like you still have a gun in your holster when someone actually fires at you. It's just a mischaracterization. But two, we think the reason people conceal carry is because they're afraid of cops, right? Like that's the reason in the first place. And when you start having codified laws against you using that like force so readily, that's when people will probably stop doing the need to conceal carry because you make a safer world. Next, she says police just won't follow the law, right? We think they don't follow the law because like killing a black person isn't necessarily illegal right now, right? Like the question isn't immediately the question immediately is what did they do to threaten you? It's not like why did you shoot them? It's like what did that person do to you, cop? Like tell us right now so we can make sure you get off. We think that when that narrative changes, that's when police actually start to follow the law, right? Next, she says it's not fair because people do have the right to take Crown laws. Well, maybe we shouldn't. We don't see why Stephen and I can't also advocate that stand your ground laws are probably shitty things that we don't like, right? And again, we think it goes back to the idea that people probably feel the need to conceal carry less when there's less of like an arms race between police and people. All right. Next is police officers will no longer have the ability to defend bystanders. This just isn't true. One, once you get fired upon, you can defend the bystanders. And we think we prevent that violence more, but preemptive fire probably causes more people to fire preemptively. But two, the model only addresses the cop, right? There's nothing in the model that says we can't say cops can defend other people preemptively. They don't tell you why that's not reach in the model, so we think we can access it. Finally, she says the large majority of people do it right. It's not a reason to take the right away from the few. But we tell you that the social impact is enough, and I'm going to start talking about this in questions, right? Because the few people have destroyed society's view of cops. It's literally led to riots in Ferguson that have crippled an economy and led to numerous deaths, right? Although it's true, we think the few people who have changed this narrative are enough for us to realize the problem exists and take a step to change it. I'm going to argue why this step is the one. All right, so is the impact significant? Yes. First, we have to answer for you why this is necessarily going to work. Because the odd case is premised on the concept that police will choose not to respond and they will avoid low socioeconomic communities because of the threat of being killed. They also contradict themselves later and say they'll over-respond. It's confusing. All right, so this gets answered really well. First of all, the first government with BERNE comes up and tells you that police understand this commitment they have made, right? And they realize this commitment and thus will protect that commitment they have made. Stephen comes and gives you the analysis as to why, even if that wasn't true, why they will continue to defend the law that's been in place. One, we think police officers have things like armor and healthcare and legal structures that others don't have, so they don't really have this threat of violence all the time. But two, he tells you people live for this role. We think a lot of times cops do become cops because they like the fact that they'll be put in situations, even if it is low-income people, even if it is a socioeconomic minority, they don't understand. But three, we think that they face not having a job because they never understand, I can't just answer the phone and be like, hey Bob, what's going on? Oh, it's a low-income community? Not going there. They have to do their job, right? There's a paycheck involved in it. So we think that answers pretty back a lot of what they bring up. But let's talk about the shift in ideology, because it comes down to who has a right to self-defense and ultimately what solves this racial balance. And Ops' only argument is that cops will over-engage and then they won't, right? So what will actually happen, because Steve and I actually give you some clear argumentation. BERNE tells you the need, we have a need to solve for racism. Steve tells you necessarily why it happens, right? Because it changes fundamentally the way we view law. One, we think it's legally codified. And we think that Steve uses the argumentation that police necessarily respect the law insofar as their life goal is to protect the law. But secondarily, I think the use of non-lethal force automatically makes people think that life is important, right? Because if I'm about to attack someone and I think I'm going to kill them, I automatically think of them as a threat or not a threat. Or if I'm using a non-lethal force, I think like, well, obviously I have to keep them alive. To what extent am I going to protect myself? That automatically has the connotation of life being valuable. We think that that shifts the narrative. But three, he tells you about the media narrative that spreads, because we get away from this question of like, we get away from the question of like, did the cop do X or Y, but was the cop racist becomes our narrative. Like, what actions were taken, what was in the mindset, and these social impacts are enough to change our relation with the police, right? Or to change how we interact in our society that we think it is justified. Go ahead.
Okay, don't let them strawman us by them just not understanding our argument. Police will do two things. They will stop doing their job just like they did in New York City, and they will also implement racist policies that allow them to preemptively be racist and preemptively prevent harm. It's not a double
Okay, so cops stopped doing their job in New York City because they were getting paid. And secondarily, we think that what happens is you do engage with the community when you have signed up for that oath because it's so dear to you as a cop, right? The reason they don't engage now is because the law doesn't protect against it. When the law says that this is an issue and you can be put in jail for it, that's when you change your paradigm. But to what extent does an officer have the right to fire? Because officers use a lot of scrutiny. They say just because they signed up for it doesn't mean they have to face any legal danger. They literally call it dehumanization. But what do cops have? Again, a lot of stuff. One, pride, the embodiment of the law. Two, the legal protection in healthcare. It comes like the death penalty happening if you even attempt to kill a cop. They understand they're going to be legally protected no matter what, right? So cops are inherently advantaged from the beginning. What do citizens have? Nothing, right? Like, literally, Michael Brown sat on the road for an hour because no one gave a shit. They were trying to find out if it was justified, or like the cop killed him justifiably enough before they even picked the body up. But secondarily, the immediate question comes to what did he do, right? And insofar as these protections are significantly outweighed, right? Like the cop is significantly protected against any sort of damage to where the person isn't. We have to realize this problem exists and have to change the privileges to solve the problem, right? We don't think cops are just going to go out and start dying. We don't think they're going to avoid their obligations as police officers and not protect anything. We do think this changes the narrative. It teaches responsibility. And ultimately, this is the only way we can change the idea that you don't just shoot someone because they're colored differently than you are.
Thank you very much. And to close out this debate and the tournament, the opposition winner.
painting the world as post-policy. So the first question that I want to ask is that, does this infringe on your rights as a police officer? And yes, you are a police officer, not like a drone, right? You're not a machine. You're still a human. You still have rights. And then if it does, is this deplorable? Should this happen? It is deplorable. It should not happen. And then the second question is going to be what society looks like afterwards, and is it a better world or is worse world? Shocking, it's a worse world, right? And that's why opposition is going to win this debate. But before I do, I want to clarify some of the large assertions that are made up and down side government. My partner brought to you the idea that most of the examples that they give to you, i.e. Ferguson, right? The problem is that you still have to be able to meet a certain burden right now. If you are preempting something, you have to be able to see that there was a perceivable threat. You have to show it was justified. What is the problem right now? The problem is that our justice system is racist. Our justice system is not making these people meet that certain standard. It's not the very notion of them being able to have the capability of doing this, but rather it's the idea that they are not being told, or they're not being, I guess, like questioned as to what are the reasons that they did this. The idea now that they are going to further put these individuals in the very system that's racist by prosecuting them is absolutely ludicrous, right? I see absolutely no solvency here because you're still then prosecuting the individuals in the same racist system. The problem are not the majority of individuals who don't end up using these weapons, but the few that end up using them incorrectly and then are not tried. We must pay attention to this. My partner Melanie brought to you very clearly that what happened in Ferguson, they realized, was not justified. They should have brought them to court. That would not be solved, though, under their policy. Then they talk to you about this type of notion where the question is, did the cop do X or Y, and was it justified? We're fine with that question. The problem is that question is not being answered right now. If that question was answered, they can go ahead and ask, was it justified? We'd rather that question be asked, but instead right now, under the system we have, it's being ignored. We don't think you're actually solving it on their side of the house. First point of crystallization, does this infringe on your rights? Because there's rhetoric up and down side government that somehow, coming out of opening government, that you basically took on this risk to die as being a police officer, right? And you took on a risk. You took on a risk to protect individuals, but that did not mean that you said that somehow I can just stand here and go ahead and take whatever comes at me. My partner gives you the justification as saying that you too, particularly inside of the United States, live in a society in which other individuals have the opportunity or, I don't know, privilege to hold guns on them. And then we heard coming out of the last speaker that if the cops didn't have guns, you wouldn't have guns. Are you kidding me? Go to Compton, go to Pomona, go to any area like the Bronx. Your damn ass will still have a gun. But now who doesn't have the gun? The police officer. The police officer who now has to say, well, I'm not sure, or I don't have enough justification that they preempted me. And then we heard this really wonky thing coming out of Trevor, in which he said, well, we didn't say you couldn't protect the people around you. What? So now you can say, oh, I shot him because I was protecting the girl next to me, right? This is ludicrous. My partner comes up to here and talks to you about that a police officer is not just symbolic and representing and protecting themselves, but also the bystanders. Because very few times is in an isolated incident in which that police officer is there. There are other people, there are other individuals, there are other of those individuals they're supposed to be protecting that side government wants to. Unfortunately now, they cannot say that I have the justification to do so, and instead have to be shot at first. Who knows how to shoot better? Do we wait for the individual that happens to, I don't know, perhaps be the criminal and wait for them to shoot, or the person that wasn't training? The person that we, as a society, collectively, I guess whether you like it or not, sign on to the social contract that you give up some rights. I know we all hear the social contract all the time. But you give up some rights in order to be protected. Those police officers are supposed to protect you. Unfortunately, when my partner comes up here and talks to you about, it's the idea that a police officer most certainly has a right to protect themselves. Unfortunately, this rhetoric up and down the side of the house is that you're not allowing them to do so. They are the arbiter of the rights, right? But unfortunately, they're taking away that power. Unfortunately, what they're telling society, as a police officer, cannot be trusted. That is the last thing that we want to tell society, is that your police officer, your one beacon of hope that you're allowed to walk down the street, should not be trusted. Unfortunately, we live in a very scary world in which a 24-hour news media cycle is very scary, and it tells you every single police officer you should be scared of. The reality of the situation is the majority of them you should not be scared of. But this type of rhetoric is pervasive. I'll take you in a moment. It's the same type of rhetoric in which we saw last week in Ferguson. 3 police officers were shot because they are told that you should not trust these individuals. The very individuals that you are supposed to trust. We think that's a problem. Before I continue, go ahead, back half.
Right. Sure, the legal system is prejudiced, but that's why police officers can take advantage of the benefit of the doubt. When using preemptive lethal force is explicitly legal, that loophole closes, and the Ferguson officers were not killed because of that.
Unfortunately, they're still in the system. They're still a very high burden to meet, right? We think that you're still putting them inside of the system in which it is racist, okay? Because right now, institutional racism ends up kind of we turn a blind eye to it a lot of the time. But individual racists, we can point a finger to. Under the status quo, we have these individual racists. They go on the TV. We're all talking about it. This institutional racism that's still going to exist under their side of the house are not going to find these people or they're not going to find them to be guilty, and we think that's a problem. But the second is, what does society look like as a whole? Because my partner talks to you about the idea in which we're entrenching this us versus them mentality, and we simply cannot have that, because we can see that's happening right now. Coming out of opening government, we hear a policy in which it worked, and it's not the policy that they should be upholding as opening government, right? Because we teach them that there are other means to use, but if you don't feel comfortable, or if you, as being a trained individual, cannot use it, you have the opportunity to use a gun. But this us versus them mentality is incredibly important to look at. Why? Because now we see them as all killers. Now we see that this law has to be applied to the people that you are supposed to trust. Why? Because they can't be expected to uphold the law. To uphold the law that you and every one of us in here, or if you're in Florida, I guess we're Stand Your Ground law, the Castle Doctrine, have the ability to. We want to go ahead and recognize that these individuals must uphold the law. We have to have society trusting them. My partner shows you this facade of solvency. We don't think at the end of the day you're actually going to be able to see this institutional racism completely go away, right? You're going to be able to see that more tickets are still going to be given, that more African Americans or minorities are still going to have to go ahead and be incarcerated. We don't think you're solving for it. At least right now we have that dialogue. At least right now we're able to say that overall we trust our officers, and for all these reasons, I'm very proud to oppose it.
Thank you very much. I would now invite the competitors to shake hands, make friends, make nice, and then the judges shall now exit the room so that we can find a little better place to adjudicate in a large hall and kick all of you out.
Are you posting any of the videos you're taking up anywhere?
On YouTube.
Oh, that'd be great. Can I get a link to your YouTube page?
Yeah, you want to just give me a
Yeah, let me give you one of my cards.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Right. Okay, Jake.
And what school are you from?
UCLA.
Oh, okay, perfect. No worries.
Okay, thanks.